Chapter V. The Incident of the Unknown Tree. Dr. Lewis, smiling indulgently, and quite prepared for some monstrous piece of theorizing, led Remnant into the room that overlooked the terraced garden and the sea. The doctor's house, though it was only a 10 minutes walk from the center of the town, seemed remote from all other habitations. The drive to it from the road came through a deep grove of trees and a dense shrubbery. Trees were about the house on either side, mingling with neighboring groves, and below, the garden fell down, terrace by green terrace, to wild growth, a twisted path amongst red rocks, and at last to the yellow sand of a little cove. The room to which the doctor took Remnant looked over these terraces and across the water to the dim boundaries of the bay. It had French windows that were thrown wide open, and the two men sat in the soft light of the lamp. This was before the days of severe lighting regulations in the far west, and enjoyed the sweet odors and the sweet vision of the summer evening. Then Remnant began. "I suppose, Lewis, you've heard these extraordinary stories of bees and dogs and things that have been going about lately." "Certainly I have heard them. I was called in at Place Neuilly, and treated Thomas Trevor, who's only just out of danger, by the way. I certified for the poor child, Mary Trevor. She was dying when I got to the place. There was no doubt she was stung to death by bees, and I believe there were other very similar cases at Lantarnam and Morwen, none fatal, I think." "What about them?" "Well, then there are the stories of good-tempered old sheepdogs turning wicked and savaging children." "Quite so. I haven't seen any of these cases professionally, but I believe the stories are accurate enough." "And the old woman assaulted by her own poultry?" "That's perfectly true. Her daughter put some stuff of their own concoction on her face and neck, and then she came to me. The wound seemed going all right, so I told her to continue the treatment, whatever it might be." "Very good," said Mr. Remnant. He spoke now with an italic impressiveness. "Don't you see the link between all this and the horrible things that have been happening about here for the last month?" Lewis stared at Remnant in amazement. He lifted his red eyebrows and lowered them in a kind of scowl. His speech showed traces of his native accent. "Great burning," he exclaimed. "What on earth are you getting at now? It is madness. Do you mean to tell me that you think there is some connection between a swarm or two of bees that have turned nasty, a cross dog, and a wicked old barn door cock, and these poor people that have been pitched over the cliffs and hammered to death on the road? There's no sense in it, you know." "I am strongly inclined to believe that there is a great deal of sense in it," replied Remnant, with extreme calmness. "Look here, Lewis, I saw you grinning the other day at the club when I was telling the fellows that in my opinion all these outrages had been committed, certainly by the Germans, but by some method of which we have no conception. But what I meant to say when I talked about inconceivables was just this, that the Williamses and the rest of them have been killed in some way that's not in theory at all, not in our theory, at all events, some way we've not contemplated, not thought of for an instant. Do you see my point?" "Well, in a sort of way." "You mean there's an absolute originality in the method?" "I suppose that is so. But what next?" Remnant seemed to hesitate, partly from a sense of the portentous nature of what he was about to say, partly from a sort of half unwillingness to part with so profound a secret. "Well," he said, "you will allow that we have two sets of phenomena of a very extraordinary kind occurring at the same time. Don't you think that it's only reasonable to connect the two sets with one another?" "So the philosopher of Tenterden Steeple and the Goodwin Sands thought, certainly," said Lewis. "But what is the connection? Those poor folks on the highway weren't stung by bees or worried by a dog. And horses don't throw people over cliffs or stifle them in marshes. No, I never meant to suggest anything so absurd. It is evident to me that in all these cases of animals turning suddenly savage the cause has been terror, panic, fear. The horses that went charging into the camp were mad with fright, we know. And I say that in the other instances we have been discussing the cause was the same. The creatures were exposed to an infection of fear, and a frightened beast or bird or insect uses its weapons, whatever they may be. If, for example, there had been anybody with those horses when they took their panic, they would have lashed out at him with their heels. Yes, I dare say that that is so. Well, my belief is that the Germans have made an extraordinary discovery. I have called it the Z-ray. You know that the ether is merely an hypothesis. We have to suppose that it's there to account for the passage of the Marconi current from one place to another. Now, suppose that there is a psychic ether as well as a material ether. Suppose that it is possible to direct irresistible impulses across this medium. Suppose that these impulses are towards murder or suicide. Then I think that you have an explanation of the terrible series of events that have been happening in Myrion for the last few weeks. And it is quite clear to my mind that the horses and the other creatures have been exposed to this Z-ray, and that it has produced on them the effect of terror, with ferocity as the result of terror. Now what do you say to that? Telepathy, you know, is well established, so is hypnotic suggestion. You have only to look in the Encyclopedia Britannica to see that, and suggestion is so strong in some cases as to be an irresistible imperative. Now don't you feel that putting telepathy and suggestion together, as it were, you have more than the elements of what I call the Z-ray? I feel myself that I have more to go on in making my hypothesis than the inventor of the steam engine had in making his hypothesis when he saw the lid of the kettle bobbing up and down. What do you say? Dr. Lewis made no answer. He was watching the growth of a new, unknown tree in his garden. The doctor made no answer to Remnant's question. For one thing, Remnant was profuse in his eloquence. He has been rigidly condensed in this history, and Lewis was tired of the sound of his voice. For another thing, he found the Z-ray theory almost too extravagant to be bearable, wild enough to tear patience to tatters. And then as the tedious argument continued, Lewis became conscious that there was something strange about the night. It was a dark summer night. The moon was old and faint, above the dragon's head across the bay, and the air was very still. It was so still that Lewis had noted that not a leaf stirred on the very tip of a high tree that stood out against the sky, and yet he knew that he was listening to some sound that he could not determine or define. It was not the wind in the leaves, it was not the gentle wash of the water of the sea against the rocks, that latter sound he could distinguish quite easily. But there was something else. It was scarcely a sound, it was as if the air itself trembled and fluttered, as the air trembles in a church when they open the great pedal pipes of the organ. The doctor listened intently. It was not an illusion, the sound was not in his own head, as he had suspected for a moment, but for the life of him he could not make out whence it came or what it was. He gazed down into the night over the terraces of his garden, now sweet with the scent of the flowers of the night, tried to peer over the treetops across the sea towards the dragon's head. It struck him suddenly that this strange fluttering vibration of the air might be the noise of a distant aeroplane or airship. There was not the usual droning hum, but this sound might be caused by a new type of engine. A new type of engine? Possibly it was an enemy airship. Their range, it had been said, was getting longer, and Lewis was just going to call Remnant's attention to the sound, to its possible cause, and to the possible danger that might be hovering over them, when he saw something that caught his breath and his heart with wild amazement and a touch of terror. He had been staring upward into the sky, and, about to speak to Remnant, he had let his eyes drop for an instant. He looked down towards the trees in the garden, and saw with utter astonishment that one had changed its shape in the few hours that had passed since the setting of the sun. There was a thick grove of ilexes bordering the lowest terrace, and above them rose one tall pine, spreading its head of sparse, dark branches dark against the sky. As Lewis glanced down over the terraces he saw that the tall pine tree was no longer there. In its place there rose above the ilexes what might have been a greater ilex. There was the blackness of a dense growth of foliage rising like a broad and far-spreading and rounded cloud over the lesser trees. Here, then, was a sight wholly incredible, impossible. It is doubtful whether the process of the human mind in such a case has ever been analyzed and registered. It is doubtful whether it ever can be registered. It is hardly fair to bring in the mathematician, since he deals with absolute truth, so far as mortality can conceive absolute truth, but how would a mathematician feel if he were suddenly confronted with a two-sided triangle? I suppose he would instantly become a raging madman, and Lewis, staring wide-eyed and wild-eyed at a dark and spreading tree which his own experience informed him was not there, felt for an instant that shock which should affront us all when we first realize the intolerable antinomy of Achilles and the tortoise. Common sense tells us that Achilles will flash past the tortoise almost with the speed of the lightning. The inflexible truth of mathematics assures us that till the earth boils and the heavens cease to endure, the tortoise must still be in advance, and thereupon we should, in common decency, go mad. We do not go mad, because, by special grace, we are certified that, in the final court of appeal, all science is a lie, even the highest science of all, and so we simply grin at Achilles and the tortoise, as we grin at Darwin, deride Huxley, and laugh at Herbert Spencer. Dr. Lewis did not grin. He glared into the dimness of the night, at the great spreading tree that he knew could not be there. And as he gazed he saw that what at first appeared the dense blackness of foliage was fretted and starred with wonderful appearances of lights and colors. Afterwards he said to me, I remember thinking to myself, look here, I am not delirious, my temperature is perfectly normal. I am not drunk, I only had a pint of Graves with my dinner, over 3 hours ago. I have not eaten any poisonous fungus, I have not taken anhyalonium lewenii experimentally. So, now then. What is happening? The night had gloomed over, clouds obscured the faint moon and the misty stars. Lewis rose, with some kind of warning and inhibiting gesture to Remnant, who, he was conscious, was gaping at him in astonishment. He walked to the open French window, and took a pace forward onto the path outside, and looked, very intently, at the dark shape of the tree, down below the sloping garden, above the washing of the waves. He shaded the light of the lamp behind him by holding his hands on each side of his eyes. The mass of the tree that couldn't be there, stood out against the sky, but not so clearly, now that the clouds had rolled up. Its edges, the limits of its leafage, were not so distinct. Lewis thought that he could detect some sort of quivering movement in it, though the air was at a dead calm. It was a night on which one might hold up a lighted match and watch it burn without any wavering or inclination of the flame. You know, said Lewis, how a bit of burnt paper will sometimes hang over the coals before it goes up the chimney, and little worms of fire will shoot through it. It was like that, if you should be standing some distance away. Just threads and hairs of yellow light I saw, and specks and sparks of fire, and then a twinkling of a ruby no bigger than a pinpoint, and a green wandering in the black, as if an emerald were crawling, and then little veins of deep blue. Woe is me! I said to myself in Welsh, what is all this color and burning? And, then, at that very moment there came a thundering rap at the door of the room inside, and there was my man telling me that I was wanted directly up at the Garth, as old Mr. Trevor Williams had been taken very bad. I knew his heart was not worth much, so I had to go off directly, and leave Remnant to make what he could of it all. Chapter 6. Mr. Remnant's Z-Ray. Dr. Lewis was kept some time at the Garth. It was past 12 when he got back to his house. He went quickly to the room that overlooked the garden and the sea, and threw open the French window and peered into the darkness. There, dim indeed against the dim sky but unmistakable, was the tall pine with its sparse branches, high above the dense growth of the ilex trees. The strange boughs which had amazed him had vanished, there was no appearance now of colors or of fires. He drew his chair up to the open window and sat there gazing and wondering far into the night, till brightness came upon the sea and sky, and the forms of the trees in the garden grew clear and evident. He went up to his bed at last, filled with a great perplexity, still asking questions to which there was no answer. The doctor did not say anything about the strange tree to Remnant. When they next met, Lewis said that he had thought there was a man hiding amongst the bushes, this in explanation of that warning gesture he had used, and of his going out into the garden and staring into the night. He concealed the truth because he dreaded the Remnant doctrine that would undoubtedly be produced. Indeed, he hoped that he had heard the last of the theory of the Z-ray. But Remnant firmly reopened the subject. "We were interrupted just as I was putting my case to you," he said. "And to sum it all up, it amounts to this, that the Huns have made one of the great leaps of science. They are sending suggestions, which amount to irresistible commands, over here, and the persons affected are seized with suicidal or homicidal mania. The people who were killed by falling over the cliffs or into the quarry probably committed suicide, and so with the man and boy who were found in the bog. As to the highway case, you remember that Thomas Evans said that he stopped and talked to Williams on the night of the murder. In my opinion, Evans was the murderer. He came under the influence of the ray, became a homicidal maniac in an instant, snatched Williams's spade from his hand and killed him and the others. The bodies were found by me on the road. It is possible that the first impact of the ray produces violent nervous excitement, which would manifest itself externally. Williams might have called to his wife to come and see what was the matter with Evans. The children would naturally follow their mother. It seems to me simple. And as for the animals, the horses, dogs, and so forth, they, as I say, were no doubt panic-stricken by the ray, and hence driven to frenzy. Why should Evans have murdered Williams instead of Williams murdering Evans? Why should the impact of the ray affect one and not the other? Why does one man react violently to a certain drug, while it makes no impression on another man? Why is A able to drink a bottle of whiskey and remain sober, while B is turned into something very like a lunatic after he has drunk 3 glasses? It is a question of idiosyncrasy, said the doctor. Is idiosyncrasy Greek for I don't know? Asked Remnant. Not at all, said Lewis, smiling blandly. I mean that in some diatheses whiskey, as you have mentioned, whiskey appears not to be pathogenic, or at all events not immediately pathogenic. In other cases, as you very justly observed, there seems to be a very marked cachexia associated with the exhibition of the spirit in question, even in comparatively small doses. Under this cloud of professional verbiage, Lewis escaped from the club and from Remnant. He did not want to hear any more about that dreadful ray, because he felt sure that the ray was all nonsense. But asking himself why he felt this certitude in the matter, he had to confess that he didn't know. An aeroplane, he reflected, was all nonsense before it was made, and he remembered talking in the early 90s to a friend of his about the newly discovered X-rays. The friend laughed incredulously, evidently didn't believe a word of it, till Lewis told him that there was an article on the subject in the current number of the Saturday Review, whereupon the unbeliever said, "Oh, is that so? Oh, really? I see," and was converted on the X-ray faith on the spot. Lewis, remembering this talk, marveled at the strange processes of the human mind, its illogical and yet all-compelling ergos, and wondered whether he himself was only waiting for an article on the Z-ray in the Saturday Review to become a devout believer in the doctrine of Remnant. But he wondered with far more fervor as to the extraordinary thing he had seen in his own garden with his own eyes. The tree that changed all its shape for an hour or two of the night, the growth of strange boughs, the apparition of secret fires among them, the sparkling of emerald and ruby lights, how could one fail to be afraid with great amazement at the thought of such a mystery? Dr. Lewis's thoughts were distracted from the incredible adventure of the tree by the visit of his sister and her husband. Mr. and Mrs. Merritt lived in a well-known manufacturing town of the Midlands, which was now, of course, a centre of munition work. On the day of their arrival at Porth, Mrs. Merritt, who was tired after the long, hot journey, went to bed early, and Merritt and Lewis went into the room by the garden for their talk and tobacco. They spoke of the year that had passed since their last meeting, of the weary dragging of the war, of friends that had perished in it, of the hopelessness of an early ending of all this misery. Lewis said nothing of the terror that was on the land. One does not greet a tired man who is come to a quiet, sunny place for relief from black smoke and work and worry with a tale of horror. Indeed, the doctor saw that his brother-in-law looked far from well. And he seemed jumpy. There was an occasional twitch of his mouth that Lewis did not like at all. "Well," said the doctor, after an interval of silence and port wine, "I am glad to see you here again. Porth always suits you." I don't think you're looking quite up to your usual form. But 3 weeks of Myri on air will do wonders. Well, I hope it will, said the other. I am not up to the mark. Things are not going well at Midlingham. Business is all right, isn't it? Yes. Business is all right. But there are other things that are all wrong. We are living under a reign of terror. It comes to that. What on earth do you mean? Well, I suppose I may tell you what I know. It's not much. I didn't dare write it. But do you know that at every one of the munition works in Midlingham and all about it there's a guard of soldiers with drawn bayonets and loaded rifles day and night? Men with bombs, too. And machine guns at the big factories. German spies. You don't want Lewis guns to fight spies with. Nor bombs. Nor a platoon of men. I woke up last night. It was the machine gun at Bennington's Army Motor Works. Firing like fury. And then bang. 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 That was the hand bombs. But what against? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what is happening, Merritt repeated, and he went on to describe the bewilderment and terror that hung like a cloud over the great industrial city in the Midlands, how the feeling of concealment, of some intolerable secret danger that must not be named, was worst of all. A young fellow I know, he said, was on short leave the other day from the front, and he spent it with his people at Belmont, that's about 4 miles out of Midlingham, you know. Thank God, he said to me, I am going back tomorrow. It's no good saying that the Wipers salient is nice, because it isn't. But it's a damned sight better than this. At the front you know what you're up against anyhow. At Midlingham everybody has the feeling that we're up against something awful and we don't know what. It's that makes people inclined to whisper. There's terror in the air. Merritt made a sort of picture of the great town cowering in its fear of an unknown danger. People are afraid to go about alone at nights in the outskirts. They make up parties at the stations to go home together if it's anything like dark, or if there are any lonely bits on their way. But why? I don't understand. What are they afraid of? Well, I told you about my being awakened up the other night with the machine guns at the motor works rattling away, and the bombs exploding and making the most terrible noise. That sort of thing alarms one, you know. It's only natural. Indeed, it must be very terrifying. You mean, then, there is a general nervousness about, a vague sort of apprehension that makes people inclined to herd together. There's that, and there's more. People have gone out that have never come back. There were a couple of men in the train to Holme, arguing about the quickest way to get to North End, a sort of outlying part of Holme where they both lived. They argued all the way out of Midlingham, one saying that the high road was the quickest though it was the longest way. It's the quickest going because it's the cleanest going, he said. The other chap fancied a short cut across the fields, by the canal. It's half the distance, he kept on. Yes, if you don't lose your way, said the other. Well, it appears they put an even half-crown on it, and each was to try his own way when they got out of the train. It was arranged that they were to meet at the wagon in North End. I shall be at the wagon first, said the man who believed in the short cut, and with that he climbed over the stile and made off across the fields. It wasn't late enough to be really dark, and a lot of them thought he might win the stakes. But he never turned up at the wagon or anywhere else for the matter of that. What happened to him? He was found lying on his back in the middle of a field some way from the path. He was dead. The doctors said he'd been suffocated. Nobody knows how. Then there have been other cases. We whisper about them at Midlingham, but we're afraid to speak out. Lewis was ruminating all this profoundly. Terror in Myrion and terror far away in the heart of England, but at Midlingham, so far as he could gather from these stories of soldiers on guard, of crackling machine guns, it was a case of an organized attack on the munitioning of the army. He felt that he did not know enough to warrant his deciding that the terror of Myrion and of Stratfordshire were one. Then Merritt began again. There's a queer story going about, when the doors shut and the curtains drawn, that is, as to a place right out in the country over the other side of Midlingham, on the opposite side to Dunwich. They've built one of the new factories out there, a great red brick town of sheds they tell me it is, with a tremendous chimney. It's not been finished more than a month or 6 weeks. They plumped it down right in the middle of the fields, by the line, and they're building huts for the workers as fast as they can, but up to the present the men are billeted all about, up and down the line. About 200 yards from this place there's an old footpath, leading from the station and the main road up to a small hamlet on the hillside. Part of the way this path goes by a pretty large wood, most of it thick undergrowth. I should think there must be 20 acres of wood, more or less. As it happens, I used this path once long ago, and I can tell you it's a black place of nights. A man had to go this way one night. He got along all right till he came to the wood. And then he said his heart dropped out of his body. It was awful to hear the noises in that wood. Thousands of men were in it, he swears that. It was full of rustling, and pattering of feet trying to go dainty, and the crack of dead boughs lying on the ground as someone trod on them, and swishing of the grass, and some sort of chattering speech going on, that sounded, so he said, as if the dead sat in their bones and talked. He ran for his life, anyhow, across fields, over hedges, through brooks. He must have run, by his tail, 10 miles out of his way before he got home to his wife, and beat at the door, and broke in, and bolted it behind him. There is something rather alarming about any wood at night, said Dr. Lewis. Merritt shrugged his shoulders. People say that the Germans have landed, and that they are hiding in underground places all over the country. Chapter 7. The Case of the Hidden Germans. Lewis gasped for a moment, silent in contemplation of the magnificence of rumor. The Germans already landed, hiding underground, striking by night, secretly, terribly, at the power of England. Here was a conception which made the myth of the Russians a paltry fable, before which the legend of Mons was an ineffectual thing. It was monstrous. And yet, he looked steadily at Merritt, a square-headed, black-haired, solid sort of man. He had symptoms of nerves about him for the moment, certainly, but one could not wonder at that, whether the tales he told were true, or whether he merely believed them to be true. Lewis had known his brother-in-law for 20 years or more, and had always found him a sure man in his own small world. But then, said the doctor to himself, those men, if they once get out of the ring of that little world of theirs, they are lost. Those are the men that believed in Madame Blavatsky. Well, he said, what do you think yourself? The Germans landed and hiding somewhere about the country, there's something extravagant in the notion, isn't there? I don't know what to think. You can't get over the facts. There are the soldiers with their rifles and their guns at the works all over Stratfordshire, and those guns go off. I told you I'd heard them. Then who are the soldiers shooting at? That's what we ask ourselves at Midlingham. Quite so, I quite understand. It's an extraordinary state of things. It's more than extraordinary, it's an awful state of things. It's terror in the dark, and there's nothing worse than that. As that young fellow I was telling you about said, at the front you do know what you're up against. And people really believe that a number of Germans have somehow got over to England and have hid themselves underground. People say they've got a new kind of poison gas. Some think that they dig underground places and make the gas there, and lead it by secret pipes into the shops. Others say that they throw gas bombs into the factories. It must be worse than anything they've used in France, from what the authorities say. The authorities? Do they admit that there are Germans in hiding about Midlingham? No. They call it explosions. But we know it isn't explosions. We know in the Midlands what an explosion sounds like and looks like. And we know that the people killed in these explosions are put into their coffins in the works. Their own relations are not allowed to see them. And so you believe in the German theory? If I do, it's because one must believe in something. Some say they've seen the gas. I heard that a man living in Dunwich saw it one night like a black cloud with sparks of fire in it floating over the tops of the trees by Dunwich Common. The light of an ineffable amazement came into Lewis's eyes. The night of remnants visit, the trembling vibration of the air, the dark tree that had grown in his garden since the setting of the sun, the strange leafage that was starred with burning, with emerald and ruby fires, and all vanished away when he returned from his visit to the garth, and such a leafage had appeared as a burning cloud far in the heart of England. What intolerable mystery, what tremendous doom was signified in this? But one thing was clear and certain, that the terror of Meirion was also the terror of the Midlands. Lewis made up his mind most firmly that if possible all this should be kept from his brother-in-law. Merritt had come to Porth as to a city of refuge from the horrors of Midlingham. If it could be managed he should be spared the knowledge that the cloud of terror had gone before him and hung black over the western land. Lewis passed the port and said in an even voice, "Very strange, indeed, a black cloud with sparks of fire. I can't answer for it, you know, it's only a rumor." "Just so, and you think or you're inclined to think that this and all the rest you've told me is to be put down to the hidden Germans?" "As I say, because one must think something." "I quite see your point. No doubt, if it's true, it's the most awful blow that has ever been dealt at any nation in the whole history of man. The enemy established in our vitals. But is it possible, after all? How could it have been worked?" Merritt told Lewis how it had been worked, or rather, how people said it had been worked. The idea, he said, was that this was a part, and a most important part, of the great German plot to destroy England and the British Empire. The scheme had been prepared years ago, some thought soon after the Franco-Prussian War. Moltke had seen that the invasion of England, in the ordinary sense of the term invasion, presented very great difficulties. The matter was constantly in discussion in the inner military and high political circles, and the general trend of opinion in these quarters was that at the best, the invasion of England would involve Germany in the gravest difficulties, and leave France in the position of the tertius gaudens. This was the state of affairs when a very high Prussian personage was approached by the Swedish professor, Publius. Thus Merritt, and here I would say in parenthesis that this Publius was by all accounts an extraordinary man. Considered personally and apart from his writings he would appear to have been a most amiable individual. He was richer than the generality of Swedes, certainly far richer than the average university professor in Sweden. But his shabby, green frock coat, and his battered, furry hat were notorious in the university town where he lived. No one laughed, because it was well known that Professor Publius spent every penny of his private means and a large portion of his official stipend on works of kindness and charity. He hid his head in a garret, someone said, in order that others might be able to swell on the first floor. It was told of him that he restricted himself to a diet of dry bread and coffee for a month in order that a poor woman of the streets, dying of consumption, might enjoy luxuries in hospital. And this was the man who wrote the treatise De Facinore Humano, to prove the infinite corruption of the human race. Oddly enough, Professor Publius wrote the most cynical book in the world. Hobbes preaches rosy sentimentalism in comparison with the very highest motives. He held that a very large part of human misery, misadventure, and sorrow was due to the false convention that the heart of man was naturally and in the main well disposed and kindly, if not exactly righteous. Murderers, thieves, assassins, violators, and all the host of the abominable, he says in one passage, are created by the false pretense and foolish credence of human virtue. A lion in a cage is a fierce beast, indeed, but what will he be if we declare him to be a lamb and open the doors of his den? Who will be guilty of the deaths of the men, women, and children whom he will surely devour, save those who unlock the cage? And he goes on to show that kings and the rulers of the peoples could decrease the sum of human misery to a vast extent by acting on the doctrine of human wickedness. War, he declares, which is one of the worst of evils, will always continue to exist. But a wise king will desire a brief war rather than a lengthy one, a short evil rather than a long evil. And this not from the benignity of his heart towards his enemies, for we have seen that the human heart is naturally malignant, but because he desires to conquer, and to conquer easily, without a great expenditure of men or of treasure, knowing that if he can accomplish this feat his people will love him and his crown will be secure. So he will wage brief victorious wars, and not only spare his own nation, but the nation of the enemy, since in a short war the loss is less on both sides than in a long war. And so from evil will come good. And how, asks Publius, are such wars to be waged? The wise prince, he replies, will begin by assuming the enemy to be infinitely corruptible and infinitely stupid, since stupidity and corruption are the chief characteristics of man. So the prince will make himself friends in the very councils of his enemy, and also amongst the populace, bribing the wealthy by proffering to them the opportunity of still greater wealth, and winning the poor by swelling words. For, contrary to the common opinion, it is the wealthy who are greedy of wealth, while the populace are to be gained by talking to them about liberty, their unknown God. And so much are they enchanted by the words liberty, freedom, and such like, that the wise can go to the poor, rob them of what little they have, dismiss them with a hearty kick, and win their hearts and their votes forever, if only they will assure them that the treatment which they have received is called liberty. Guided by these principles, says Publius, the wise prince will entrench himself in the country that he desires to conquer, nay, with but little trouble, he may actually and literally throw his garrisons into the heart of the enemy country before war has begun. This is a long and tiresome parenthesis, but it is necessary as explaining the long tale which Merritt told his brother-in-law, he having received it from some magnate of the Midlands, who had travelled in Germany. It is probable that the story was suggested in the first place by the passage from Publius which I have just quoted. Merritt knew nothing of the real Publius, who was all but a saint. He thought of the Swedish professor as a monster of iniquity, worse, as he said, than Nietzsche, meaning, no doubt, Nietzsche. So he told the story of how Publius had sold his plan to the Germans, a plan for filling England with German soldiers. Land was to be bought in certain suitable and well-considered places, Englishmen were to be bought as the apparent owners of such land, and secret excavations were to be made, till the country was literally undermined. A subterranean Germany, in fact, was to be dug under selected districts of England. There were to be great caverns, underground cities, well drained, well ventilated, supplied with water, and in these places vast stores both of food and of munitions were to be accumulated, year after year, till the day dawned. And then, warned in time, the secret garrison would leave shops, hotels, offices, villas, and vanish underground, ready to begin their work of bleeding England at the heart. That's what Henson told me, said Merritt at the end of his long story. Henson, head of the Buckley Iron and Steel Syndicate. He has been a lot in Germany. Well, said Lewis, of course, it may be so. If it is so, it is terrible beyond words. Indeed, he found something horribly plausible in the story. It was an extraordinary plan, of course, an unheard of scheme, but it did not seem impossible. It was the Trojan horse on a gigantic scale. Indeed, he reflected, the story of the horse with the warriors concealed within it which was dragged into the heart of Troy by the deluded Trojans themselves might be taken as a prophetic parable of what had happened to England if Henson's theory were well founded. And this theory certainly squared with what one had heard of German preparations in Belgium and in France, emplacements for guns ready for the invader, German manufactories which were really German forts on Belgian soil, the caverns by the Aisne made ready for the cannon. Indeed, Lewis thought he remembered something about suspicious concrete tennis courts on the heights commanding London. But a German army hidden under English ground. It was a thought to chill the stoutest heart. And it seemed from that wonder of the burning tree, that the enemy mysteriously and terribly present at Midlingham, was present also in Myrion. Lewis, thinking of the country as he knew it, of its wild and desolate hillsides, its deep woods, its wastes and solitary places, could not but confess that no more fit region could be found for the deadly enterprise of secret men. Yet, he thought again, there was but little harm to be done in Myrion to the armies of England or to their munitionment. They were working for panic terror? Possibly that might be so, but the camp under the highway? That should be their first object, and no harm had been done there. Lewis did not know that since the panic of the horses men had died terribly in that camp, that it was now a fortified place, with a deep, broad trench, a thick tangle of savage barbed wire about it, and a machine gun planted at each corner. Chapter 8. What Mr. Merritt found. Mr. Merritt began to pick up his health and spirits a good deal. For the first morning or two of his stay at the doctor's he contented himself with a very comfortable deck chair close to the house, where he sat under the shade of an old mulberry tree beside his wife and watched the bright sunshine on the green lawns, on the creamy crests of the waves, on the headlands of that glorious coast, purple even from afar with the imperial glow of the heather, on the white farmhouses gleaming in the sunlight, high over the sea, far from any turmoil, from any troubling of men. The sun was hot, but the wind breathed all the while gently, incessantly, from the east, and Merritt, who had come to this quiet place, not only from dismay, but from the stifling and oily airs of the smoky Midland town, said that that east wind, pure and clear and like well water from the rock, was new life to him. He ate a capital dinner, at the end of his first day at Porth, and took rosy views. As to what they had been talking about the night before, he said to Lewis, no doubt there must be trouble of some sort, and perhaps bad trouble, still, Kitchener would soon put it all right. So things went on very well. Merritt began to stroll about the garden, which was full of the comfortable spaces, groves, and surprises that only country gardens know. To the right of one of the terraces he found an arbor or summer house covered with white roses, and he was as pleased as if he had discovered the pole. He spent a whole day there, smoking and lounging and reading a rubbishy sensational story, and declared that the Devonshire roses had taken many years off his age. Then on the other side of the garden there was a filbert grove that he had never explored on any of his former visits, and again there was a find. Deep in the shadow of the filberts was a bubbling well, issuing from rocks, and all manner of green, dewy ferns growing about it and above it, and an angelica springing beside it. Merritt knelt on his knees, and hollowed his hand and drank the well water. He said, over his port, that night that if all water were like the water of the filbert well the world would turn to teetotalism. It takes a townsman to relish the manifold and exquisite joys of the country. It was not till he began to venture abroad that Merritt found that something was lacking of the old rich peace that used to dwell in Myrion. He had a favourite walk which he never neglected, year after year. This walk led along the cliffs towards Myros, and then one could turn inland and return to Porth by deep winding lanes that went over the Alt. So Merritt set out early one morning and got as far as a sentry box at the foot of the path that led up to the cliff. There was a sentry pacing up and down in front of the box, and he called on Merritt to produce his pass, or to turn back to the main road. Merritt was a good deal put out, and asked the doctor about this strict guard. And the doctor was surprised. I didn't know they had put their bar up there, he said. I suppose it's wise. We are certainly in the far west here, still, the Germans might slip round and raid us and do a lot of damage just because Myrion is the last place we should expect them to go for. But there are no fortifications, surely, on the cliff. Oh, no, I never heard of anything of the kind there. Well, what's the point of forbidding the public to go on the cliff, then? I can quite understand putting a sentry on the top to keep a lookout for the enemy. What I don't understand is a sentry at the bottom who can't keep a lookout for anything, as he can't see the sea. And why warn the public off the cliffs? I couldn't facilitate a German landing by standing on Pengareg, even if I wanted to. It is curious, the doctor agreed. Some military reasons, I suppose. He let the matter drop, perhaps because the matter did not affect him. People who live in the country all the year round, country doctors certainly, are little given to desultory walking in search of the picturesque. Lewis had no suspicion that sentries whose object was equally obscure were being dotted all over the country. There was a sentry, for example, by the quarry at Lanfy Hangel, where the dead woman and the dead sheep had been found some weeks before. The path by the quarry was used a good deal, and its closing would have inconvenienced the people of the neighborhood very considerably. But the sentry had his box by the side of the track and had his orders to keep everybody strictly to the path, as if the quarry were a secret fort. It was not known till a month or two ago that one of these sentries was himself a victim of the terror. The men on duty at this place were given certain very strict orders, which from the nature of the case, must have seemed to them unreasonable. For old soldiers, orders are orders, but here was a young bank clerk, scarcely in training for a couple of months, who had not begun to appreciate the necessity of hard, literal obedience to an order which seemed to him meaningless. He found himself on a remote and lonely hillside. He had not the faintest notion that his every movement was watched, and he disobeyed a certain instruction that had been given him. The post was found deserted by the relief. The sentry's dead body was found at the bottom of the quarry. This by the way, but Mr. Merritt discovered again and again that things happened to hamper his walks and his wanderings. 2 or 3 miles from Porth there is a great marsh made by the Avon River before it falls into the sea, and here Merritt had been accustomed to botanize mildly. He had learned pretty accurately the causeways of solid ground that lead through the sea of swamp and ooze and soft yielding soil, and he set out one hot afternoon determined to make a thorough exploration of the marsh, and this time to find that rare bog bean, that he felt sure, must grow somewhere in its wide extent. He got into the by-road that skirts the marsh, and to the gate which he had always used for entrance. There was the scene as he had known it always, the rich growth of reeds and flags and rushes, the mild black cattle grazing on the islands of firm turf, the scented procession of the meadowsweet, the royal glory of the loose strife, flaming pennons, crimson and golden, of the giant dock. But they were bringing out a dead man's body through the gate. A laboring man was holding open the gate on the marsh. Merritt, horrified, spoke to him and asked who it was, and how it had happened. They do say he was a visitor at Porth. Somehow he has been drowned in the marsh, whatever. But it's perfectly safe. I've been all over it a dozen times. Well, indeed, we did always think so. If you did slip by accident, like, and fall into the water, it was not so deep, it was easy enough to climb out again. And this gentleman was quite young, to look at him, poor man, and he has come to Myrion for his pleasure and holiday and found his death in it. Did he do it on purpose? Is it suicide? They say he had no reasons to do that. Here the sergeant of police in charge of the party interposed, according to orders, which he himself did not understand. A terrible thing, sir, to be sure, and a sad pity, and I am sure this is not the sort of sight you have come to see down in Myrion this beautiful summer. So don't you think, sir, that it would be more pleasant like, if you would leave us to this sad business of ours? I have heard many gentlemen staying in Porth say that there is nothing to beat the view from the hill over there, not in the whole of Wales. Every one is polite in Myrion, but somehow Merritt understood that, in English, this speech meant move on. Merritt moved back to Porth. He was not in the humor for any idle, pleasurable strolling after so dreadful a meeting with death. He made some inquiries in the town about the dead man, but nothing seemed known of him. It was said that he had been on his honeymoon, that he had been staying at the Porth Castle Hotel, but the people of the hotel declared that they had never heard of such a person. Merritt got the local paper at the end of the week. There was not a word in it of any fatal accident in the marsh. He met the sergeant of police in the street. That officer touched his helmet with the utmost politeness and "I hope you are enjoying yourself, sir, indeed you do look a lot better already," but as to the poor man who was found drowned or stifled in the marsh, he knew nothing. The next day Merritt made up his mind to go to the marsh to see whether he could find anything to account for so strange a death. What he found was a man with an armlet standing by the gate. The armlet had the letters C.W. on it, which are understood to mean coast watcher. The watcher said he had strict instructions to keep everybody away from the marsh. Why? He didn't know, but some said that the river was changing its course since the new railway embankment was built, and the marsh had become dangerous to people who didn't know it thoroughly. Indeed, sir, he added, it is part of my orders not to set foot on the other side of that gate myself, not for one scrag end of a minute. Merritt glanced over the gate incredulously. The marsh looked as it had always looked, there was plenty of sound, hard ground to walk on, he could see the track that he used to follow as firm as ever. He did not believe in the story of the changing course of the river, and Lewis said he had never heard of anything of the kind. But Merritt had put the question in the middle of general conversation, he had not led up to it from any discussion of the death in the marsh, and so the doctor was taken unawares. If he had known of the connection in Merritt's mind between the alleged changing of the Afon's course and the tragical event in the marsh, no doubt he would have confirmed the official explanation. He was, above all things, anxious to prevent his sister and her husband from finding out that the invisible hand of terror that ruled at Midlingham was ruling also in Meirion. Lewis himself had little doubt that the man who was found dead in the marsh had been struck down by the secret agency, whatever it was, that had already accomplished so much of evil, but it was a chief part of the terror that no one knew for certain that this or that particular event was to be ascribed to it. People do occasionally fall over cliffs through their own carelessness, and as the case of Garcia, the Spanish sailor, showed, cottagers and their wives and children are now and then the victims of savage and purposeless violence. Lewis had never wandered about the marsh himself, but Remnant had pottered round it and about it, and declared that the man who met his death there, his name was never known, in Porth at all events must either have committed suicide by deliberately lying prone in the ooze and stifling himself, or else must have been held down in it. There were no details available, so it was clear that the authorities had classified this death with the others. Still, the man might have committed suicide, or he might have had a sudden seizure and fallen in the slimy water face downwards. And so on. It was possible to believe that case A or B or C was in the category of ordinary accidents or ordinary crimes. But it was not possible to believe that A and B and C were all in that category. And thus it was to the end, and thus it is now. We know that the terror reigned, and how it reigned, but there were many dreadful events ascribed to its rule about which there must always be room for doubt. For example, there was the case of the Mary Ann, the rowing boat which came to grief in so strange a manner, almost under Merritt's eyes. In my opinion he was quite wrong in associating the sorry fate of the boat and her occupants with a system of signaling by flashlights which he detected or thought that he detected, on the afternoon in which the Mary Ann was capsized. I believe his signaling theory to be all nonsense, in spite of the naturalized German governess who was lodging with her employers in the suspected house. But, on the other hand, there is no doubt in my own mind that the boat was overturned and those in it drowned by the work of the terror. Chapter 9. The Light on the Water. Let it be noted carefully that so far Merritt had not the slightest suspicion that the terror of Midlingham was quick over Meirion. Lewis had watched and shepherded him carefully. He had let out no suspicion of what had happened in Meirion, and before taking his brother-in-law to the club he had passed round a hint among the members. He did not tell the truth about Midlingham, and here again is a point of interest, that as the terror deepened the general public cooperated voluntarily, and, one would say, almost subconsciously, with the authorities in concealing what they knew from one another, but he gave out a desirable portion of the truth, that his brother-in-law was nervy, not by any means up to the mark, and that it was therefore desirable that he should be spared the knowledge of the intolerable and tragic mysteries which were being enacted all about them. He knows about that poor fellow who was found in the marsh, said Lewis, and he has a kind of vague suspicion that there is something out of the common about the case, but no more than that. A clear case of suggested, or rather commanded suicide, said Remnant. I regard it as a strong confirmation of my theory. Perhaps so, said the doctor, dreading lest he might have to hear about the Z-ray all over again. But please don't let anything out to him, I want him to get built up thoroughly before he goes back to Midlingham. Then, On the other hand, Merritt was as still as death about the doings of the Midlands. He hated to think of them, much more to speak of them, and thus, as I say, he and the men at the Porth Club kept their secrets from one another, and thus, from the beginning to the end of the terror, the links were not drawn together. In many cases, no doubt, A and B met every day and talked familiarly, it may be confidentially, on other matters of all sorts, each having in his possession half of the truth, which he concealed from the other. So the two halves were never put together to make a whole. Merritt, as the doctor guessed, had a kind of uneasy feeling it scarcely amounted to a suspicion as to the business of the marsh, chiefly because he thought the official talk about the railway embankment and the course of the river rank nonsense. But finding that nothing more happened, he let the matter drop from his mind, and settled himself down to enjoy his holiday. He found to his delight that there were no sentries or watchers to hinder him from the approach to Larnac Bay, a delicious cove, a place where the ash grove and the green meadow and the glistening bracken sloped gently down to red rocks and firm yellow sands. Merritt remembered a rock that formed a comfortable seat, and here he established himself of a golden afternoon, and gazed at the blue of the sea and the crimson bastions and bays of the coast as it bent inward to Sarna and swept out again southward to the odd-shaped promontory called the Dragon's Head. Merritt gazed on, amused by the antics of the porpoises who were tumbling and splashing and gambolling a little way out at sea, charmed by the pure and radiant air that was so different from the oily smoke that often stood for heaven at Midlingham, and charmed, too, by the white farmhouses dotted here and there on the heights of the curving coast. Then he noticed a little rowboat at about 200 yards from the shore. There were 2 or 3 people aboard, he could not quite make out how many, and they seemed to be doing something with a line. They were no doubt fishing, and Merritt, who disliked fish, wondered how people could spoil such an afternoon, such a sea, such pellucid and radiant air by trying to catch white, flabby, offensive, evil-smelling creatures that would be excessively nasty when cooked. He puzzled over this problem and turned away from it to the contemplation of the crimson headlands. And then he says that he noticed that signaling was going on. Flashing lights of intense brilliance, he declares, were coming from one of those farms on the heights of the coast. It was as if white fire was spouting from it. Merritt was certain, as the light appeared and disappeared, that some message was being sent, and he regretted that he knew nothing of heliography. 3 short flashes, a long and very brilliant flash, then 2 short flashes. Merritt fumbled in his pocket for pencil and paper so that he might record these signals, and, bringing his eyes down to the sea level, he became aware, with amazement and horror, that the boat had disappeared. All that he could see was some vague, dark object far to westward, running out with the tide. Now it is certain, unfortunately, that the Mary Ann was capsized and that 2 schoolboys and the sailor in charge were drowned. The bones of the boat were found amongst the rocks far along the coast, and the 3 bodies were also washed ashore. The sailor could not swim at all, the boys only a little, and it needs an exceptionally fine swimmer to fight against the outward suck of the tide as it rushes past Pengareg Point. But I have no belief whatever in Merritt's theory. He held, and still holds, for all I know, that the flashes of light which he saw coming from P. Nural, the farmhouse on the height, had some connection with the disaster to the Mary Ann. When it was ascertained that a family were spending their summer at the farm, and that the governess was a German, though a long naturalized German, Merritt could not see that there was anything left to argue about, though there might be many details to discover. But, in my opinion, all this was a mere mare's nest. The flashes of brilliant light were caused, no doubt, by the sun lighting up one window of the farmhouse after the other. Still, Merritt was convinced from the very first, even before the damning circumstance of the German governess was brought to light, and on the evening of the disaster, as Lewis and he sat together after dinner, he was endeavoring to put what he called the common sense of the matter to the doctor. "If you hear a shot," said Merritt, "and you see a man fall, you know pretty well what killed him." There was a flutter of wild wings in the room. A great moth beat to and fro and dashed itself madly against the ceiling, the walls, the glass bookcase. Then a sputtering sound, a momentary dimming of the lamp. The moth had succeeded in its mysterious quest. "Can you tell me," said Lewis as if he were answering Merritt, "why moths rush into the flame?" Lewis had put his question as to the strange habits of the common moth to Merritt with the deliberate intent of closing the debate on death by heliograph. The query was suggested, of course, by the incident of the moth in the lamp, and Lewis thought that he had said, "Oh, shut up," in a somewhat elegant manner. And, in fact, Merritt looked dignified, remained silent, and helped himself to port. That was the end that the doctor had desired. He had no doubt in his own mind that the affair of the Mary Ann was but one more item in the long account of horrors that grew larger almost with every day, and he was in no humor to listen to wild and futile theories as to the manner in which the disaster had been accomplished. Here was a proof that the terror that was upon them was mighty not only on the land but on the waters, for Lewis could not see that the boat could have been attacked by any ordinary means of destruction. From Merritt's story, it must have been in shallow water. The shore of Larnac Bay shelves very gradually, and the Admiralty charts showed the depth of water 200 yards out to be only 2 fathoms, this would be too shallow for a submarine. And it could not have been shelled, and it could not have been torpedoed, there was no explosion. The disaster might have been due to carelessness. Boys, he considered, will play the fool anywhere, even in a boat, but he did not think so, the sailor would have stopped them. And, it may be mentioned, that the 2 boys were as a matter of fact extremely steady, sensible young fellows, not in the least likely to play foolish tricks of any kind. Lewis was immersed in these reflections. Having successfully silenced his brother-in-law, he was trying in vain to find some clue to the horrible enigma. The Midlingham theory of a concealed German force, hiding in places under the earth, was extravagant enough, and yet it seemed the only solution that approached plausibility, but then again even a subterranean German host would hardly account for this wreckage of a boat, floating on a calm sea. And then what of the tree with the burning in it that had appeared in the garden there a few weeks ago, and the cloud with the burning in it that had shone over the trees of the Midland village? I think I have already written something of the probable emotions of the mathematician confronted suddenly with an undoubted 2-sided triangle. I said, if I remember, that he would be forced, in decency, to go mad, and I believe that Lewis was very near to this point. He felt himself confronted with an intolerable problem that most instantly demanded solution, and yet, with the same breath, as it were, denied the possibility of there being any solution. People were being killed in an inscrutable manner by some inscrutable means, day after day, and one asked why and how, and there seemed no answer. In the Midlands, where every kind of munitionment was manufactured, the explanation of German agency was plausible, and even if the subterranean notion was to be rejected as savoring altogether too much of the fairytale, or rather of the sensational romance, yet it was possible that the backbone of the theory was true. The Germans might have planted their agents in some way or another in the midst of our factories. But here in Myrion, what serious effect could be produced by the casual and indiscriminate slaughter of a couple of schoolboys in a boat, of a harmless holiday-maker in a marsh? The creation of an atmosphere of terror and dismay? It was possible, of course, but it hardly seemed tolerable, in spite of the enormities of Louvain and of the Lusitania. Into these meditations, and into the still dignified silence of Merritt broke the rap on the door of Lewis's man, and those words which harass the ease of the country doctor when he tries to take any ease: "You're wanted in the surgery, if you please, sir." Lewis bustled out, and appeared no more that night. The doctor had been summoned to a little hamlet on the outskirts of Porth, separated from it by half a mile or 3/4 of road. One dignifies, indeed, this settlement without a name in calling it a hamlet. It was a mere row of 4 cottages, built about 100 years ago for the accommodation of the workers in a quarry long since disused. In one of these cottages the doctor found a father and mother weeping and crying out to Dr. Bach, and 2 frightened children, and one little body, still and dead. It was the youngest of the 3, little Johnny, and he was dead. The doctor found that the child had been asphyxiated. He felt the clothes, they were dry, it was not a case of drowning. He looked at the neck, there was no mark of strangling. He asked the father how it had happened, and father and mother, weeping most lamentably, declared they had no knowledge of how their child had been killed, unless it was the people that had done it. The Celtic fairies are still malignant. Lewis asked what had happened that evening, where had the child been? Was he with his brother and sister? Don't they know anything about it? Reduced into some sort of order from its original piteous confusion, this is the story that the doctor gathered. All three children had been well and happy through the day. They had walked in with the mother, Mrs. Roberts, to Porth on a marketing expedition in the afternoon. They had returned to the cottage, had had their tea, and afterwards played about on the road in front of the house. John Roberts had come home somewhat late from his work, and it was after dusk when the family sat down to supper. Supper over, the three children went out again to play with other children from the cottage next door, Mrs. Roberts telling them that they might have half an hour before going to bed. The two mothers came to the cottage gates at the same moment and called out to their children to come along and be quick about it. The two small families had been playing on the strip of turf across the road, just by the stile into the fields. The children ran across the road, all of them except Johnny Roberts. His brother Willie said that just as their mother called them he heard Johnny cry out, "Oh, what is that beautiful shiny thing over the stile?" Chapter X. The Child and the Moth. The little Robertses ran across the road, up the path, and into the lighted room. Then they noticed that Johnny had not followed them. Mrs. Roberts was doing something in the back kitchen, and Mr. Roberts had gone out to the shed to bring in some sticks for the next morning's fire. Mrs. Roberts heard the children run in and went on with her work. The children whispered to one another that Johnny would catch it when their mother came out of the back room and found him missing, but they expected he would run in through the open door any minute. But 6 or 7, perhaps 10, minutes passed, and there was no Johnny. Then the father and mother came into the kitchen together, and saw that their little boy was not there. They thought it was some small piece of mischief that the two other children had hidden the boy somewhere in the room, in the big cupboard perhaps. "What have you done with him then?" said Mrs. Roberts. "Come out, you little rascal, directly in a minute." There was no little rascal to come out, and Margaret Roberts, the girl, said that Johnny had not come across the road with them, he must be still playing all by himself by the hedge. "What did you let him stay like that for?" said Mrs. Roberts. "Can't I trust you for 2 minutes together? Indeed to goodness, you are all of you more trouble than you are worth." She went to the open door. "Johnny! Come you in directly, or you will be sorry for it. Johnny!" The poor woman called at the door. She went out to the gate and called there. "Come you, little Johnny. Come you, Bachjan, there's a good boy. I do see you hiding there." She thought he must be hiding in the shadow of the hedge, and that he would come running and laughing. He was always such a happy little fellow to her across the road. But no little merry figure danced out of the gloom of the still, dark night. It was all silence. It was then, as the mother's heart began to chill, though she still called cheerfully to the missing child, that the elder boy told how Johnny had said there was something beautiful by the stile, and perhaps he did climb over, and he is running now about the meadow, and has lost his way. The father got his lantern then, and the whole family went crying and calling about the meadow, promising cakes and sweets and a fine toy to poor Johnny if he would come to them. They found a little body, under the ash grove in the middle of the field. He was quite still and dead, so still that a great moth had settled on his forehead, fluttering away when they lifted him up. Dr. Lewis heard the story. There was nothing to be done, little to be said to these most unhappy people. "Take care of the two that you have left to you," said the doctor as he went away. "Don't let them out of your sight if you can help it. It is dreadful times that we are living in." It is curious to record, that all through these dreadful times the simple little season went through its accustomed course at Porth. The war and its consequences had somewhat thinned the numbers of the summer visitors, still a very fair contingent of them occupied the hotels and boarding houses and lodging houses and bathed from the old-fashioned machines on one beach, or from the new-fashioned tents on the other, and sauntered in the sun, or lay stretched out in the shade under the trees that grow down almost to the water's edge. Porth never tolerated Ethiopians or shows of any kind on its sands, but the Rockets did very well during that summer in their garden entertainment, given in the castle grounds, and the fit-up companies that came to the assembly rooms are said to have paid their bills to a woman and to a man. Porth depends very largely on its Midland and Northern custom of a prosperous, well-established sort. People who think Llandudno overcrowded and Colwyn Bay too raw and red and new, come year after year to the placid old town in the southwest and delight in its peace, and as I say, they enjoyed themselves much as usual there in the summer of 1915. Now and then they became conscious, as Mr. Merritt became conscious, that they could not wander about quite in the old way, but they accepted sentries and coast watchers and people who politely pointed out the advantages of seeing the view from this point rather than from that as very necessary consequences of the dreadful war that was being waged. Nay, as a Manchester man said, after having been turned back from his favourite walk to Castell Cock, it was gratifying to think that they were so well looked after. So far as I can see, he added, there's nothing to prevent a submarine from standing out there by YNYS Sand and landing half a dozen men in a collapsible boat in any of these little coves? And pretty fools we should look, shouldn't we, with our throats cut on the sands, or carried back to Germany in the submarine. He tipped the coast watcher half a crown. That's right, lad, he said, you give us the tip. Now here was a strange thing. The North Countryman had his thoughts on elusive submarines and German raiders, the watcher had simply received instructions to keep people off the Castell Cock fields, without reason assigned. And there can be no doubt that the authorities themselves, while they marked out the fields as in the terror zone, gave their orders in the dark and were themselves profoundly in the dark as to the manner of the slaughter that had been done there, for if they had understood what had happened, they would have understood also that their restrictions were useless. The Manchester man was warned off his walk about 10 days after Johnny Roberts's death. The watcher had been placed at his post because, the night before, a young farmer had been found by his wife lying in the grass close to the castle, with no scar on him, nor any mark of violence, but stone dead. The wife of the dead man, Joseph Craddock, finding her husband lying motionless on the dewy turf, went white and stricken up the path to the village and got 2 men who bore the body to the farm. Lewis was sent for, and knew, at once when he saw the dead man that he had perished in the way that the little Roberts boy had perished, whatever that awful way might be. Craddock had been asphyxiated, and here again there was no mark of a grip on the throat. It might have been a piece of work by Burke and Hare, the doctor reflected, a pitch plaster might have been clapped over the man's mouth and nostrils and held there. Then a thought struck him, his brother-in-law had talked of a new kind of poison gas that was said to be used against the munition workers in the Midlands. Was it possible that the deaths of the man and the boy were due to some such instrument? He applied his tests but could find no trace of any gas having been employed. Carbonic acid gas. A man could not be killed with that in the open air, to be fatal that required a confined space, such a position as the bottom of a huge vat or of a well. He did not know how Craddock had been killed, he confessed it to himself. He had been suffocated, that was all he could say. It seemed that the man had gone out at about 9:30 to look after some beasts. The field in which they were was about 5 minutes' walk from the house. He told his wife he would be back in a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes. He did not return, and when he had been gone for 3/4 of an hour Mrs. Craddock went out to look for him. She went into the field where the beasts were, and everything seemed all right, but there was no trace of Craddock. She called out, there was no answer. Now the meadow in which the cattle were pastured is high ground, a hedge divides it from the fields which fall gently down to the castle and the sea. Mrs. Craddock hardly seemed able to say why, having failed to find her husband among his beasts, she turned to the path which led to Castell Cock. She said at first that she had thought that one of the oxen might have broken through the hedge and strayed, and that Craddock had perhaps gone after it. And then, correcting herself, she said, "There was that, and then there was something else that I could not make out at all. It seemed to me that the hedge did look different from usual. To be sure, things do look different at night, and there was a bit of sea mist about, but somehow it did look odd to me, and I said to myself, have I lost my way, then?" She declared that the shape of the trees in the hedge appeared to have changed, and besides, it had a look as if it was lighted up, somehow, and so she went on towards the stile to see what all this could be, and when she came near everything was as usual. She looked over the stile and called and hoped to see her husband coming towards her or to hear his voice, but there was no answer, and glancing down the path she saw, or thought she saw, some sort of brightness on the ground, a dim sort of light like a bunch of glowworms in a hedge bank. And so I climbed over the stile and went down the path, and the light seemed to melt away, and there was my poor husband lying on his back, saying not a word to me when I spoke to him and touched him. So for Louis the terror blackened and became altogether intolerable, and others, he perceived, felt as he did. He did not know. He never asked whether the men at the club had heard of these deaths of the child and the young farmer, but no one spoke of them. Indeed, the change was evident. At the beginning of the terror men spoke of nothing else, now it had become all too awful for ingenious chatter or labored and grotesque theories. And Louis had received a letter from his brother-in-law at Midlingham. It contained the sentence, "I am afraid Fanny's health has not greatly benefited by her visit to Porth. There are still several symptoms I don't at all like." And this told him, in a phraseology that the doctor and Merritt had agreed upon, that the terror remained heavy in the Midland town. It was soon after the death of Craddock that people began to tell strange tales of a sound that was to be heard of nights about the hills and valleys to the northward of Porth. A man who had missed the last train from Miros and had been forced to tramp the 10 miles between Miros and Porth seems to have been the first to hear it. He said he had got to the top of the hill by Treedone Oak, somewhere between 10:30 and 11, when he first noticed an odd noise that he could not make out at all. It was like a shout, a long, drawn-out, dismal wail coming from a great way off, faint with distance. He stopped to listen, thinking at first that it might be owls hooting in the woods, but it was different, he said. From that, it was a long cry, and then there was silence and then it began over again. He could make nothing of it, and feeling frightened, he did not quite know of what, he walked on briskly and was glad to see the lights of Porth Station. He told his wife of this dismal sound that night, and she told the neighbors, and most of them thought that it was all fancy or drink, or the owls after all. But the night after, 2 or 3 people, who had been to some small merrymaking in a cottage just off the Miros road, heard the sound as they were going home, soon after 10. They, too, described it as a long, wailing cry, indescribably dismal in the stillness of the autumn night, like the ghost of a voice, said one, as if it came up from the bottom of the earth, said another.